This is a video on how to create a Visual Basic project in Visual Studio 2017 Community Edition. On this computer, I'm going to search for it by just typing in Studio. I see here when I type in Studio, I see Visual Studio 2015. I see a blend edition of both the 15 and the 17. I want to stay away from the blend edition and even away from the 2015 version. I want to choose Visual Studio 2017. Once I open it up, I get the start screen. I then want to follow along with the first lab assignment and walk through those steps one by one. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the new projects. And when I pull up new project, right now it's defaulted to Visual C++. It is very important that you follow those steps in the lab with all of the circles around the screenshot and make sure all of those things are checked off. So the first thing I want to do is go to Visual Basic. So Visual C++ and Visual Basic can sort of look the same, but make sure you choose Visual Basic. I then want to go to Windows Form Applications, select that. And then down here, I want to name my first lab. I'm going to name it 123 Conway. This is my class code, that 3-digit seat number that I gave you, and your last name. So for instance, yours might be 237 Smith or 238 Miller. I'm also going to suffix it with lab 1. Now, right now, if I save this, it's going to be saved in a folder that I'm really going to have to dig for to get it. So I want to change this by clicking on Browse and then making sure I save it onto my desktop. So I'm going to select the desktop folder, and now it will be saved to my desktop. I also want to make sure that these two boxes are deselected. All of this is shown in the handout for the first lab. I'll click OK, and it will go about making my project for me. Now, when I make my project, I want to identify 4 certain areas in this interface. So now I have my project, and I'm going to make sure I have my project by minimizing this window and going over here to check to see that I do have a project created. So I'm back inside of here. The 4 important things that I should have up, the first one is the Solution Explorer. If I don't see the Solution Explorer, I can go to the View menu and select Solution Explorer and get that up or open. The next thing I should see here is the main area, and in the main area I have a form here that I'm going to widen just a little bit because I'm going to add to this form. The third thing that I should see here is the Properties window. The Properties window is going to allow me to change the names of some of the things that I put on the form in the main area. Now, if I don't see the Properties window, I can always go here to the View menu and select Properties window. And the last thing that's really important is something called the toolbox. Now, right off screen right here, I'll scroll it over a little bit, move it over a little bit. There's a little tab here for a toolbox. If I click on it, it explodes out. If I click on it again, it moves in. This toolbox, if you don't see it, can also be obtained by going to the View menu again and choosing Toolbox. Because mine is there, what I'm going to do is click on it, explode it out, and then I'm going to drag it and drop it in this area over here to let it just float over there so I can easily access it. So I'm going to make this window a little larger. Again, these are the 4 things that I should see: my main area, my toolbox, my Solution Explorer, and my properties window. Once you have found all of those things, you're ready to go on and start creating that first lab, okay? For the lab, we are going to use common controls. There are 4 common controls that we're going to use a lot in this class. They are the button control, the label control, the list box control, and the text box control. All 4 of these controls will be used to create our interface. So I'm simply going to put these controls on the form in the fashion that I see on the first lab. So I'm going to add a button here. I'm going to add 4 labels. I can drag the label over, or I can simply double click and it will put another label in there. So I'm going to take these labels and put them in order. Notice when I move this, a little line shows up to help me line them up and make sure they're in order. So now I have my 3 labels and my button. The next thing I'm going to put up here is a list box. I'm going to put my list box right there in the middle of the screen, but I'm going to make it a little larger. I can change the size of it by simply clicking and dragging on any of these knobs, and that will allow me to resize it. And the last thing I'm going to put up here are 3 text boxes. So I'm going to put one and then double click and put the other 2. And again, I'm going to make sure they line up nice and neatly with the labels and with each other. Now that I have all of the controls that I want on the screen, I am now ready to change the properties of some of these. So how do I do that? The first thing I need to do to change the properties down here in the properties window is to put them in an order where I can see everything alphabetically. So instead of listing them by categories, I'm going to click right here and change them to an alphabetical listing. Now that they're in an alphabetical listing, I can easily find things by scrolling through them alphabetically. So the first thing I want to change right here is I want to go up here and change the names of some of these controls. So for instance, I want to change the name of the button control. How do I do that? Well, the first thing I need to do is click on the button. And by the way, I'm going to make this button a little bit larger. So I want to click on the button and make sure it's selected. And now the properties window pertain to that button. I want to change the name of it. You might think to change the name, it would be under N. But the name is a special property, so it's listed all the way up at the top and it's in parentheses and labeled the name field. So I want to make this button BTN Calc. So one thing we're going to do with all of our controls is to give it some prefix so we know exactly what kind of control we're using. So in this case, I'm changing a button. I prefix it with BTN. If I'm changing a text box, I prefix it with TXT. A list box, LST. So I'm going to go now and change the text boxes. So I'm going to name this first text box right here, and I'm going to call it TXT name. Notice I clicked on that text box first, and then I'm going to click on the next text box, and by default it's called text box 2, but I'm going to name it TXT hours. And then for the last text box, I'm going to change the name to TXT wage. So it is very important that I name these exactly as it specifies on the sheet, with the uppercase letters and the prefix and everything exactly as it's seen. The last thing I want to name is the list box, and I'm going to call it LST results because this is where my results will show up. Please note, it's a common mistake to think that this is a 1. It is not a 1, it's LST results. And now that I have everything named, I want to change cosmetically some of these labels. I will change this label by going down to the text box. And for this text box, I'm going to call this 123 my last name. So that's my class code and my last name. You will use your class code and your last name to name this top label or the header of this interface. So I'm going to go to label 2 and notice again I'm in the text box to change the values of these labels. And I'm going to call this label name. I'm going to call the next label hours worked, and I'm going to call the last label wage. I'm also going to change the caption on the button by clicking on the button and changing the text to calc pay. Now that I have all of the things done on the interface is now set and ready. Notice that there's a little star right here next to the design view. That is telling me that I have not saved this project. So how do I save this project? This is very important. Please do not go to the File menu and select Save As. This will destroy your project and separate it and make it to a point where you cannot retrieve it. So please do not go to Save As. Instead, this little icon up here is a Save All icon. If you click on that, it will save your entire project, no problems at all. If you go to Save As, you're going to have problems. So I clicked on Save All, and that little star disappeared. Notice if I move this label around just a little bit, that star reappeared because now I'm ready to save that project again because I've made some edits. So I'll click Save All. Another way to save your project is to simply run the project. Every time you run the project is saved for you. How do you run the project or execute the project? You can simply go to the debug menu and click on Start Debugging. You can also click on this green arrow here to start it, or you can simply hit F5 on the keyboard, which I just did. The project is building right now, and a few seconds later, my interface shows up. So notice the interface looks a little bit different from the design, and this is white and that's blue. But now it's ready for me to start entering in values. The problem is I don't have any code behind this yet, so it's a moot point to execute this program at this point. So how do I get the code into this project? There are several ways you can get the code into the project. I'm going to talk about what you should not do. One thing you should not do is just arbitrarily double click anywhere on this interface to get to the code window. One way to get to the code window is to simply go to View Code. If I do that, I now have the coding window up. Notice that I now have a .VB with no design and a .VB with design. That design view is my interface. The one without it is where I would put the code. Right now I can't put any code in here though. There is no place for me to put the code. So I'm going back to the design view. Another way is, again, don't just double click arbitrarily anywhere, but you can right click and go to View Code. Again, now I'm back in that coding window, but again, I don't have anywhere to enter any code. The best way to get into the coding window, this is important, double click directly on the button. Nowhere else, double click directly on the button. When you double click on the button, it's going to put in a private subroutine, and this is exactly where you'll put your code in between the private sub and the end of the private sub. Your code goes directly in there. So I am going to open up the lab, and on the third page of the lab, I have some code already created for you. Your job is to just highlight this code, copy it, and then the important part is make sure you paste it right in between the private sub and the end sub. So I'm going to just paste it right in there, and it's in there. Okay, I double check to make sure it's in there. It's in there. If I go back to the design view, how do I get to the code? I double click on the button. I'm back into the code. Okay, now that I have the code in there, I'm ready to run the program again. Again, I can just click on the little green arrow right here. On most computers, you'll be able to hit F5. If you have a Mac computer, that may not be an option, but I'm going to hit start right here. That is always an option. Notice that the stars are here again because it needs to be saved. But when I go to run this thing, it automatically saves it. The stars are gone before it runs it. And now my program is up and running. It's got code behind it, so I can put in some values. I'll put in Mary. I'll put in 50 hours worked and $90 pay. And I have some values here. That is really all you're going to do for the first lab. So I'm going to close this box up again. Do I have to save it? Nope, it's already saved. If I have to save it, I will not go to Save As. Instead, I will just click on this disk icon right here and do a Save All. And since it is saved and it's running properly, I'm going to close the entire project. Once I close the entire project, my next task is to find the project on the desktop, right-click on it, and send it to a zipped folder. On Canvas, you can only turn in a zip folder. You will not be able to turn the project in a regular folder. So you'll have to zip it up first. Now, I don't have the view of Canvas to show you how to turn it in on Canvas. If you have any questions about that, you probably should attend the first lab. The link is available under the assignment link and then lab 1.